To welcome Brother Greg, so open your hearts and keep your ears open too.
Thanks, Brother Ari. Good evening, young people. It's lovely to be here. There's such a magnificent buzz in the hall, I have to admit. It sort of takes me back a few years, dare I say it, but just to hear that excitement of everybody catching up with their friends again. And what a wonderful thing it is that we can do that. Magnificent opportunity. And as Ari said, we can open our hearts to yet another subject that God has revealed in his word. Deuteronomy 17. It's a curious section, isn't it, about kings? Probably most of us are reasonably familiar with it. We could probably list off the things that a king should do and that a king shouldn't do. But if we think about it, we have the advantage of knowing the whole of the Bible, don't we? And we know that 400-ish years after this event, something happened in the nation of Israel. And that something was that the events described here in Deuteronomy 17 actually came to pass. And of course, I'm talking about the period of time towards the end of Samuel's period as a prophet, when the people of Israel came to Samuel and said, "Give us a king to reign over us." Remember that story? 400 odd years later. What did God say? What did Samuel say to begin with? Samuel was upset, wasn't it? The people have rejected me, he said. And God said, no, the people haven't rejected you, Samuel. The people have rejected me, God, from being their king. In fact, so upset was God when the people asked for a king, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, so upset was God that he ended up... Does anyone remember what happened? You can ask lots of questions. Ari said you've got to keep your... Was it minds open or something? So what happened? Do you remember what God did? Something miraculously intervened directly? Yes. Was that rained at harvest time? Yes. So you may remember the situation. People of Israel had asked for a king, and then right at the worst time, harvest time, you've got all the things coming in. God sent this huge rain. It was like the heaven was crying, wasn't it? The sky's crying out. The people were trembling. So if that's what God thought of the establishment of a king, why did he record Deuteronomy chapter 17? It's a fair question, isn't it? If God didn't want kings, other than himself, why record Deuteronomy chapter 17? People might say, well, maybe it's because God was accepting the inevitable. They're going to do it anyway. So I might as well put some rules in place because they're going to be rebellious and they're going to do what they wanted to do and all that kind of thing. Maybe. But if that were the case, why didn't God, after the first, we might call it, experiment with Saul, when it ended in such a misery, why didn't God stop it then? Because he could have done, couldn't he? He could have said, right, you want a king, do you? Okay, I'm going to give you a king. And you're going to have Saul. And when Saul turned out to be a disaster, and he did all the things that Samuel and God warned them about, then God could have said, I told you so, I told you so. Bad idea. But he didn't. Because we know the king that succeeded Saul. The beloved. The man after God's own heart. David, the one God chose. And God didn't say, that was a dumb idea. We're not going to have any kings anymore. Instead, God said, I'm going to choose your king. See how there's a difference with that? So it's raising the question, God's disappointment when the people ask for a king doesn't necessarily appear to be related to the concept of a king. It was something else that disappointed him. Can you see how how that's the message that's coming through from the Bible. You know, if God was completely opposed to the concept of kings, we've got a bigger problem. Because approximately 400 years before Deuteronomy 17 was written, we came across a king. Who was that? You're not allowed to say. Melchizedek. Melchizedek. What a fascinating thing that is. Melchizedek. Genesis chapter 14. Melchizedek is described as the king of Salem. So he's ruling in Jerusalem, as it would become known later on, and he's described as the priest of the Most High God. So he's a king ruling in perfect harmony with God, so much so, of course, that the idea of a Melchizedek priesthood is taken up to describe the priesthood that our Lord Jesus Christ would be the high priest of. He becomes this high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So here you've got, in Genesis chapter 14, 400 years before Deuteronomy, you've got a man, a king, who's ruling in harmony with God. He's being blessed by God. He's doing God's will, and God is looking on him with favour. Interesting, isn't it? An interesting little conundrum. So you get to Deuteronomy chapter 17, God describes the king, and then our minds go back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we say, well, what other explanation could there be for God's disappointment when the people came in Samuel's day and asked for a king? There's got to be something else there, not just the fact that they were asking for a king. What else was it that disappointed God? Well, to answer that, we have to turn across to that record in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So come across there. What were the circumstances surrounding the request by the elders of Israel for a king to Samuel? So we pick it up from verse 4 of 1 Samuel chapter 8. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah. They said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now here it comes, here comes the request. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. So if you were just an observer, sort of sitting there watching this conversation happening, you'd come to the conclusion that the driver, the catalyst, the trigger for their request for a king was Samuel's son's inappropriateness to continue his role as a prophet. Wouldn't you? That's the point they say. You know, you're old, your sons don't walk in your ways, now make us a king, they say. Seems pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Have a look at verse 20. Verse 20 provides some additional information about their request. Verse 19, Samuel gives, and we're going to have a look at these intervening verses a little bit later on, but Samuel lists all the things that a king would do that would be against what they ultimately would want. And the people, verse 19, refused to obey the voice of Samuel. They said, no, but we will have a king over us. Here comes the real reason, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. That's why they wanted a king. They wanted to be like the other nations and have someone, the king, that can go out to fight battles, to win battles on their behalf. Yeah, come across to 1 Samuel chapter 12. You can see this reasoning is supported in chapter 12 of 1 Samuel. This whole issue of the people's rejection of God as their king's brought up. So Saul's now been appointed the king. And have a look at verse 11. Actually, we'll pick it up again. So this is the section where Samuel's recounting the faithfulness that he has had here. And perhaps we'll pick it up from verse 10. The people, they cried unto Yahweh, they said, we have sinned because we have forsaken Yahweh, have served Balaam and Ashtaroth, but now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies, and we will serve thee. And Yahweh sent Jerubbaal and Bedan and Jephthah and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and ye dwelled safe. So here's Samuel recounting events that occurred when God intervened on behalf of the nation of Israel through the period of the judges. And have a look at the references that are there. References to the judges: Jerubbaal, Gideon, Bedan, Jephthah, and Samuel. And in each case, as 1 Samuel 12 says, God intervened to help Israel to victorious battles. I want us to have a little bit of a look at what it was that motivated and what they understood in terms of the judges and who it was that was the one bringing their success. Let's come back to Judges chapter 8. Have a look at Judges chapter 8. So this is the incident with Gideon, or Jerubbaal, as he's called in 1 Samuel chapter 12. So again, I'm going to assume that we're reasonably familiar with the story of Gideon. Gideon, who fought against the Midianites and saved the people. And in Judges chapter 8, verse 23, we can see clearly who Gideon attributed their success to. Gideon said unto the people, Judges 8, verse 23, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. Yahweh shall rule over you. All right, so here's Samuel taking their minds back in 1 Samuel 12 to the period of the judges. And he says, remember when Gideon saved you from your enemies that were there, what was it that Gideon attributed that success to? Well, he attributed it to God, didn't he? To Yahweh. I'm not going to rule, neither my son. Yahweh will rule. And interestingly enough, Gideon had that attitude when the people he was fighting against saw him like a king. Have a look in verse 18. So you may remember the story. He caught Zebah and Zalmunna. So these were Midianite kings. Then verse 18. Then said he unto Zebah and Zalmunna, what manner of men were they whom he slew at Tabor? And they answered, as thou art, so were they. Each one resembled the children of a king. And Gideon goes on to say, well, actually, they were my brethren, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. So you can see this interesting thing that Samuel's taking the people's minds back to the work of Gideon. And Gideon, who was such a successful leader, refused to be called the people's king. He attributed their victory to God, even though the enemies of Israel looked at Gideon, looked at his brothers and said, every one of you acts and behaves just like a king. Fascinating, isn't it? And the Israelites wanted to make him a king. Judges 8, verse 22. They actually wanted to make Gideon a king, which he refused. Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. So we're trying to unpick what it was that upset God so much when the people asked for a king in the time of Saul, the end of Samuel's reign. Samuel's getting them to reflect back on the success that Gideon had and how Gideon refused to be a king and acknowledged that the victory that they had came from God. What about the elders of Israel in the times of Samuel? Come back to 1 Samuel chapter 12. You might be still thinking to yourself, we're getting bogged down here, but we've got to lay this foundation because this becomes the key to us understanding the true aspect of a king that God wanted and that God was pointing forward to in the scriptures. You know, the elders of Israel in the times of Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 12. When ye saw that Nahash, the king of the children of Ammon, came against you, ye said unto me, Nay, but a king shall reign over us, when Yahweh your God was your king. So here it is. Here comes the key. They wanted a king so they'd be like all the nations that were round about them, a king that would save them from their enemies. And Samuel says, remember those successful judges, Gideon and the others who similarly attributed their success to God. They recognised who the power of deliverance came from. It came from God. And you, he says in verse 12 here, as soon as the children of Ammon came against you, you said you wanted a king. They wanted a king to fight their battles instead of having the faith of Gideon and Jephthah to believe that God would fight their battles as their king. And it was on that basis they rejected God. So, the disappointment God had for their request was because they could not recognise that God was the one that protected them from their enemies. That's the key point. God felt the rejection of the elders of Israel in the time of Samuel, not just because they asked for a king, but because they didn't believe that God was capable of saving them from their enemies. Now, is that correct? Well, let's have a little bit of a look at the requirements that God had outlined for kings. And that was our section there. So come back to Deuteronomy chapter 17 that we read before. We've got the list of what the king shall not do. Actually, time for another question. What were the 3 things the king shouldn't do? If you were lucky and you looked, you'd know. What were they? Call them out.
Not multiply horses.
So not multiply horses. What else? Yep, that's linked to the horses piece because that's where they would go to get their horses, as Solomon did later on. What were the other 2 things?
Not multiply wives.
Not multiply wives. It's a good one, Lukey. Remember? And what was the last one? That's what he should do. This is what he shouldn't do. What was the 3rd one he shouldn't do? Money. Greatly multiply money he should not do. Silver and gold. Now that's interesting, isn't it? The 3 things that he shouldn't do. Why those 3 things? Well, actually, each one of those 3 things is really important if you're a fleshly king, isn't it? What does multiply horses do? Well, it gives you capability to wage war. The more horses you've got, the more capable you are at war. Multiplying wives gives you capability to procreate, doesn't it? It's the ultimate example of strength of a king. It's why, Henry VIII was chomping through wives at a great rate, wasn't it? Because he couldn't have any children, couldn't have any sons. So he did them in rather nastily. But that strength that comes from the capability to procreate, and greatly multiplying silver and gold, well, that gives people the capability to pretty much do whatever they want. They can buy what they want. You can buy additional armies, power. Money is power. And those 3 things that God specifically said that kings were not to do are all the capabilities that make a king successful from a fleshly perspective, aren't they? They're the things you want. If you're going to pick a king, you don't want a king that's got no ability to fight your enemies and hasn't got any offspring and no money to do anything. You want the opposite of that. And what were the 3 things God said the king had to do? The opposite side. We had one of them over there before, I think, somewhere. Write out a copy of the law. Yes. What else was there? You can look it up.
Read it.
Yes, read it. What was the last one? Do it. So he had to write out a copy. He had to read it every day. And he had to fear Yahweh and keep and do his law. And what does that mean? Well, so God's saying, I don't want you to have the capabilities that are consistent with every sort of fleshly king. What I do want you to have the capability as a king to do is to understand godliness, to practice godliness, and to lead others in godliness. See the difference between the two? And they're the capabilities that make a king successful from a godly perspective. So the very three things that make a king successful from a fleshly point of view are the opposite from the three things that make a king successful from a godly perspective. See how there's this great difference between them. God wasn't upset with the concept of the people wanting a king, per se. He was upset because they wanted a king like the nations around them to deliver them from their enemies, when that was the role of God himself. We mentioned before that the first reference to a godly established king was Genesis 14. Come back to there. So this is the story of Melchizedek. You may remember that Melchizedek comes into the scene, as it were, in the time of Abraham. So Abraham returned from the slaughter of that confederacy of nations that ended up taking Lot and his family. And Abraham, with his hired servants, miraculously, came and destroyed this confederacy. And all of this is a great type, and it's a parable, and it points forward to the work of the Lord Jesus Christ and the saints coming in and in the fighting against the latter-day Gog. But in that context, we're introduced to Melchizedek. Have a look at verse 18. And Melchizedek, we know that his name means the king of righteousness, Melchizedek. So his name itself means king of righteousness. But he is also, verse 18, the king of Salem, the king of peace. So he's the king of righteousness and the king of peace. His name means king of righteousness, and his role is the king of peace. It's clearly a king, isn't he? He brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. So this is a kingship, if you like, that's very much blessed by God. It has to be. He's the priest of the Most High God. And what happens? Well, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And he said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God." And this comes the key point here. What was Melchizedek's perspective about his role as king versus God's role? "Blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." And he, Abram, gave him, Melchizedek, tithes of all. So this is the key. Melchizedek, as the king, acknowledged that deliverance in battle came exclusively from the deliverance provided by God. Can you see that? So in the very interaction between Melchizedek, a godly approved king, and Abram, Melchizedek acknowledges that deliverance from enemies comes from God alone. And that's consistent with the characteristics of the king, isn't it? God didn't want a king like the nations around them to deliver them from their enemies, because God would do that. God did want the king to understand, to practice, and to teach others in godliness. That's what he wanted. And when a king came who did that, then the king was ruling with the blessing of God. So God's disappointment wasn't the fact they wanted a king. God's disappointment was what type of king, the role of the king that the people wanted. You know, the future foretelling of a king is outlined in the blessings to Jacob's sons. Remember that? So let's come across to Genesis 49. So Jacob's dying, and his 12 sons come come before him, and he gives them these blessings. And of course, each of the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, and those blessings had an application to the tribes and the way the tribes would continue to live out their lives for succeeding generations. So they all come before them, and he lists them off. He talks about Reuben in verse 3 and Simeon and Levi in verse 5. And then he gets to Judah in verse 8. And look what he says about Judah. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah's a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down. He couched as a lion, as an old lion. Who shall rouse him up? The sceptre, who's got a sceptre? Well, it's a king. The sceptre shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. That's interesting, isn't it? So right in Genesis chapter 49, God's giving a prophecy that says the king is going to come from the tribe of Judah. It's amazing, isn't it? It's true too, by the way, isn't it? What tribe was Jesus born into? Well, it was Judah, isn't he? He's born into the tribe of Judah. That was prophesied about here back in Genesis 49. Remarkable. But how does Jacob, speaking through the inspiration that comes from God, how does Jacob describe the key role that Judah would have, this key role of kingship, of leadership? What was it about carrying the sceptre that distinguished this particular role? Well, verse 10, the sceptre shall not depart from Judah, so that's where the kingship would be, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Can you see that description in verse 10 is exactly what God is saying in Deuteronomy 17 about the role of a king? A lawgiver, someone that could understand godliness, who would practice godliness and would lead others to godliness. That's what it says. Unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So God says, Judah, you're going to be the one through whom the line of the king's going to come, this great king, and it's going to be all about bringing people to me. Teaching people about godliness. So given that Genesis 49 in the blessing to Judah clearly says that that's where the king would come from, have you ever wondered why God chose Saul from the tribe of, where did he come from? Tribe of Benjamin. That's interesting, isn't it? Why did God choose Saul from the tribe of Benjamin? Remember, God was doing what the people wanted, wasn't he? So the people knew what they wanted. We've already seen that what they wanted was someone that could fight their battles for them, that can destroy their enemies for them. That's what disappointed God, because that's what God's role was. God's role was to destroy their enemies. But that's what the people wanted. So God chose someone from Benjamin. Why didn't he choose someone from Judah? God knew that that's where the king would come from. Would have been so much easier. You think of all the battles between Benjamin and Judah during the time of David, when Saul was alive, and then Saul's son, remember the story? They constant fighting between Abner and Joab. All young people being destroyed as a consequence of it. Wouldn't have been, you say, God, wouldn't have been so much easier. Pick the first king from Judah instead. I'm sure there were plenty of handsome, tall, young men in Judah that could have ticked the box as the people's choice for a king. Why did God pick Benjamin? Well, Benjamin had the characteristics that the people wanted. Isn't it remarkable? Have a look at verse 27 of Genesis 49. It's a short commentary on Benjamin, very short, one verse. how is Benjamin's last message, so far as the tribe is concerned, go? Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey. At night he shall divide the spoil. Isn't that incredible? God chose Saul from the tribe of Benjamin as the people's choice because he was someone who exactly fulfilled the requirements of the king that the people had asked for. Someone to deliver them from their enemies. And God chose him from the tribe of Benjamin because it was the tribe of Benjamin that is described as having the very characteristics that the people were looking for in their king. They wanted someone who's like a wolf. They wanted someone that could devour the prey. They wanted someone that could divide the spoil. And you know, Saul had a lot of failings. He had a lot of failings. There's no record of him fulfilling the tasks that are recorded in Deuteronomy 17. There's no record of him writing out a copy of the law. There's certainly unlikely that he read in it every day. His heart was clearly lifted up with pride above his brethren. He did falter to the right hand and the left, like had all those failings. But there was one thing about Saul that he could provide. In a sense, he gave the people what they were asking for. Or rather, what they asked for and thought they wanted. And that is, he was like a wolf, wasn't he? And these are the words of David when they died. Saul and Jonathan had died. And have a look at how David describes them. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. That's what Saul was like. They had said they wanted a king that could save them from their enemies, and God said, well, you got it. Here he is. Saul and Jonathan, lovely and pleasant in their lives. In their death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. There's that, the hunter, isn't it? They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? And in that sense, God gave them someone that they asked for. Disaster of a king, caused enormous damage, led the people away from God, created heartache and misery. But they asked for someone who could fight those battles. And God gave them Saul from Benjamin. It's staggering, isn't it? It's just so amazing. These aren't random things. God has built this all there. He's put into play specific details because he's in control. Yeah, it's such a great contrast when David came to the throne. Remember, Saul was the people's choice. David, of course, is God's choice. So what do we know about David? Turn up. This is worth turning up. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Amazing description here. So again, we know the general flow of the historical narrative, I'm sure, but Saul's died, and Abner sort of rises up to take over the military leadership, and there's this battle that continues between the house of David led by Joab and the house of Saul that continued on, led by Abner. And then ultimately the house of Saul waxed weaker and the house of David waxed stronger. And you get to 2 Samuel chapter 5, and this is when the whole of the nation comes to make David the king. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. That's interesting, isn't it? Thy bone and thy flesh. Direct link back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Take one that is from among thee, is what they were told. And then listen, it's also in time past, verse 2, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that slew his 10,000s. Do they say that? They don't, do they? They could have. That's what the women cried out when, remember, during the time of Saul, when in Saul's life it was all about military prowess, it was all about how many people you'd killed, it was all about the strength of your own arm. And when Saul and David came in, and remember the story, the women cried out saying, Saul's slain his thousands, David is 10,000s. What did Saul think about that? I'm going to kill him. It's a direct threat to what Saul considered to be a powerful thing, what Saul considered to be an important thing from a king. But when these people come to David, they're not talking about David's ability to slay people. Look at the characteristic that they call out. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that leddest out and broughtest in Israel. And Yahweh said to thee, thou shalt feed my people, and thou shalt be a captain over Israel. Isn't that an amazing thing? So Saul's focus and characteristic was his destructive ability. David, although an instrument of enormous effectiveness in the hand of God, David's characteristic was that of a shepherd. And that's what it is, isn't it? It's someone that leads out and brings in is the role of a shepherd. David was a shepherd to the people of Israel. David was doing exactly what God wanted the king to do, to understand godliness, to practice godliness, and to lead other people in godliness. And sure, in the exercise of those activities, David would also be working out God's judgments. He fought against and destroyed Goliath through God's help. He fought against and destroyed the Philistines through God's help. He fought against and destroyed the kingdoms that were around them, Moab, through God's help. But it wasn't the destructiveness that characterised David as a king. It was his shepherding. And that's why he was a king after God's own heart. And there's the story. That's the simple thing, isn't it? Well, what was a king all about so far as a biblical occupation is concerned? Well, if you're taking it from God's perspective, the king was about the one who brought people to God, who brought people to him. God alone was the one who has the power to destroy the enemies. The king's role is to bring people to God. You know, the Psalms are full of great expressions. It's worth just perhaps looking at a couple of them. If you come to Psalm 146 is a good example. But really, from Psalm 145 to 149, you get David acknowledging the great role that God had in the success that he had. But Psalm 146 is a good example of it. Psalm 146 is the Hallel Psalms. Praise ye Yahweh, O my soul. While I live will I praise Yahweh, I will sing praises unto my God while I have my being. Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man in whom there is no help. This is a successful king's speech. What happens to the princes of the Son of Man? Well, verse 4, their breath goes forth, they return to the earth, they're just going to die. Verse 5, happy is he that hath the ale, the God of Jacob as his help, whose hope is in Yahweh his God, because God can save us from our enemies. Come over to Psalm 149, you get the same thing. Praise Yahweh, sing unto Yahweh a new song, his praise in the congregation of the saints. Let Israel rejoice in him that made him, let the children of Zion be joyful in their king. So this is a king acknowledging the true king in God. Let them praise his name in the dance. Let them sing praise unto him with a timbrel and harp. For Yahweh taketh pleasure in his people who beautify the meek with salvation. Let the saints be joyful in glory. Let them sing aloud upon their beds. Let the high praises of ale be in their mouth, a two-edged sword in their hand, to execute vengeance upon the heathen and punishments upon the people, to bind their kings with chains and their nobles with fetters of iron, to execute upon them the judgment written. This honour have all his saints. Praise ye Yahweh. So here you've got this man after God's own heart, the king that God chose, who didn't see himself as an embodiment of fleshly power to execute his will and his desire upon the people, but instead saw himself as someone that could bring the people to God. And so far as the ultimate power of destroying the enemy was concerned, that was entirely reliant on the great King, Yahweh himself. Yeah, and that really brings us to our Lord Jesus Christ, doesn't it? The King whose right it is to take the throne on behalf of God. I need to come over to Isaiah 52. Isaiah 52 introduces this conflict that's happening, this theme of Zion who's held captive and needs to be freed from her enemies. You see that in the first couple of verses. Awake, awake, put on thy strength, O Zion, put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. For henceforth there shall no more come unto thee the uncircumcised and the unclean. Shake thyself from the dust, and sit down, O Jerusalem. Loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion. So you sort of picture this scene here. You've got this city of Jerusalem described like this captive, and she's burdened down. She's got chains about her neck, and she's going to be freed. She's going to be freed. So who can do the freeing from the enemy? Well, from a fleshly perspective, you need to have someone with a fair bit of power, don't you? Big sword, ideally head and shoulders above all the people. Wouldn't hurt if it's good looking. Yeah, that's what we naturally think. So far as the elders of Israel in the time of Samuel concerned, that's exactly what they thought, wasn't it? They wanted a king just like Saul. They saw that kind of king as being the way that they would be saved. But what is God's plan for saving? Have a look at verse 7 of Isaiah 52. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace, that bringeth good tidings of good, that publisheth salvation, that saith unto Zion, thy God reigneth. The watchmen shall lift up the voice, with a voice together shall they sing, for they shall see eye to eye when Yahweh shall bring again Zion. Break forth into joy. Sing together, you waste places of Jerusalem. For Yahweh hath comforted his people, he hath redeemed Jerusalem. Yahweh hath made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. The end of verse 12, Yahweh will go before you. The God of Israel will be your rear reward. And here's this description of the saving of this captive daughter. And it's being done in the context of the preaching of God's truth. Remarkable, isn't it? These glad tidings that are going out. The work of God, a work of redemption, is saving the people. It's still described like a battle, isn't it? There's a bared arm, there's a rear reward that's there, there's all the sort of feeling of a battle, but it's a battle that's a spiritual battle. The work of God is a battle of redemption, a battle of salvation, a salvation that would be seen through the ends of the earth. And what warrior is God going to choose to lead this battle, this ultimate fight against the enemy, this ultimate standing up, the role that the people wanted the king to do? You know, was it going to be a handsome man, head and shoulders above the rest of the people, born from a rich family? The answer is in verse 13, isn't it? Isaiah 52, verse 13. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. Here he is. Here's the one that God's going to use to win this battle. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. And what's he like? You know, it's almost like here's the unveiling. He's going to be great. As many were astonished at thee. His visage was so marred, more than any man, his form more than the sons of men. He's made high, but he's not high from a fleshly point of view, isn't he? He's despised from a fleshly point of view. His appearance is marred. But he's such a successful king in verse 15 that he's going to shut the mouths of the kings that are around him. It's just remarkable. Have a look at this little table here. You know, we looked at Deuteronomy 17, didn't we? We saw the requirements of the king, what the king needed to do. And have a look at just how well the servant king of Isaiah 52 and 53 meets it. He was God's choice. My servant, says God. And that, of course, was the requirement of the king, wasn't it? Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom Yahweh thy God shall choose. This king, the servant king, came from them. All we like sheep, brought as a lamb to the slaughter. So you can see the two things. They're like sheep. He's brought as a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep dumb before her shearers. He's numbered with the transgressors. Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, that's the characteristic that needed to be about a king, wasn't it? One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. He preached salvation. The servant king of Isaiah 52 and 53 brings good tidings, publishes peace, brings good tidings of good. And the requirements of a king in Deuteronomy 17 was to write the copy of God's law. He learned obedience. He'd grow up as a tender plant, root out of dry ground. And the requirements of a king in Deuteronomy 17 verse 19 was that he had to learn to fear Yahweh, his God. The servant king of Isaiah 52, not only was his heart not lifted up, but he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. By his stripes we are healed. And of course, the requirements of a king were that his heart be not lifted up, and that he turn not aside from the commandment. And ultimately, the servant king of Isaiah 52 and 53 did it so he could save his people. He would see his seed. He would prolong his days. And the requirements of the king in Deuteronomy 7:8 was so that he may prolong his days in his kingdom. He and his children, his seed, in the midst of Israel. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Isn't that a beautiful thing? So here you've got the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 7:8, seen in this servant king of Isaiah 52 and 53, which from a fleshly, worldly perspective means nothing. No swords, no grand robes, no pomp, no ceremony. Just someone doing what God wants. And in doing so, is far more effective than any king ever before or ever after. And you know, this king provides spoil as well. Have a look at verse 12 of Isaiah 53. Because of his effectiveness as a godly king, a godly servant king, therefore will I divide him, says God, a portion with the great. He shall divide the spoil with the strong. I mean, that's what the people wanted, wasn't it? Someone that could do it. That's what Benjamin's characteristic was. He'd get the prey because he's poured out his soul unto death. I want us to finish in Revelation. Revelation really picks up this future role of the king, and particularly our part in that as well. We haven't really spoken about our role as kings, but in fact, of course, it is. Our role is the role of kings and priests, as we know Revelation talks about in chapter 1 and in chapter 5. But if you get to Revelation 14, we've got this great vision of the kingdom. The Lamb on Mount Zion, 144,000 who are there. And verse 3 records the rejoicing of the redeemed 144,000. They're singing a song. It's a song of thanks and praise. And they're doing it before the king. They sung as it were a new song before the throne. See, there it is. There's the king. You have a king on a throne. Before the four living ones and the elders. The people that had been redeemed. And you'll notice, of course, in verse 1, that the king is a lamb. He's a lamb. It's remarkable, isn't it? It's the opposite, again, of what the people asked for in 1 Samuel 8. The opposite. They wanted the wolf. God gives the lamb. That is the powerful king. And it takes us back to Isaiah 52 and 53, isn't it? This godly servant prepared for kingship as a rejected and a despised lamb. And here in Revelation 14 is the same lamb, but he's elevated now to the greatness of the king of the whole earth. And the characteristics which made the lamb such a beautiful, powerful and effective sacrifice are the same characteristics which make the lamb such a great king and ruler. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when the people came, we mentioned this briefly, when the people came to Samuel and asked for a king, Samuel tried to dissuade them. He tried to dissuade them. He listed off all the things that the king would do. All right, this is what your king would be like. And if you had to summarise these things, your king's going to be selfish. That's what Samuel's saying. He's going to take for himself. You have a look at the themes that go through there. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, his chariots, his horsemen. He's going to appoint captains to work his ground, to reap his harvest, to make his instruments. See the emphasis? That's the point someone was making. Going to take daughters. He's going to take fields. He's going to take the tenth of what they do. He's going to take their men servants and maid servants and their best young men and their asses. He's going to take the tenth of your sheep. So you look at what Samuel's saying, and he's saying it's all selfish. A human king is selfish and he takes for his own benefit. And that's largely what Saul did, wasn't it? It's largely what Saul did. If he saw a goodly young man, it says, he'd take him, put him in the army. Too bad if you had any plans. You know, you had your own things you were going to do. Too bad. King took you. What are the characteristics of this lamb in Revelation 14? This is the manner of a godly king. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. A human king is selfish, taking for his own benefit. The godly king is selfless, giving for their benefit. See the difference between the two? It's remarkable. I'm not going to read through this section here in Revelation 14, verse 1 to 5, but it's exactly the opposite. The subjects of this king hadn't been taken against their will and made to serve in the selfish pursuits of their king, like Saul had to. Instead, they receive redemption. It's the difference. They receive it. They don't give it up. The king wouldn't take young men and appoint them for himself. Instead, the king places his father's name on their foreheads. The lamb who's ruling as king in Revelation 14 doesn't take young women for himself. Instead, all his subjects have been cleansed by him. They're all virgins, is how it's described. There's no guile found in them because their king has presented them without fault before the throne of his God. See how wonderful that is? It's the complete opposite. God's version of kingship is selfless and giving. Man's version of kingship is selfish and taking. And the people of Revelation 14 are us, if we're baptised, part of the saints. It's us, made white. We're the beneficiaries. And if we're sitting there thinking, well, that's fine, but this king sounds a bit weak, lacking a bit of courage. Does he lack courage? Well, this Lamb of Revelation 14 is not afraid to wage a war against the enemies of Yahweh, is he? You get it, comes through verse 6 through to 8. Babylon's gone. Verse 9 through to 11, the destruction, the left foot on the earth. Here's the judgments coming out. Thrust in thy sickle, verse 15, and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap. This isn't a king that lacks courage. This is an effective king who's able to, because he has his father's power, is able to destroy his father's enemy. It's a war fought with God in control. And then ultimately we get to Revelation 14. In Revelation 14, it describes the culmination of this great battle that he'll have. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. Why? Because he's Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And again, that's us. We're described as those who are kings and priests unto God in Revelation chapter 5, verse 10. And he is the King of kings, King of us, the Lord of lords. What a magnificent vision this is. What a magnificent prospect that we have of, we're not considering kings as some separate, disconnected concept in and of itself. Right from the start, God has had clearly in his mind the bringing together of kings from all ages who would be subject to the great king, even his son, the Lamb. And I want us to finish by Revelation 19. Magnificent concluding vision of Revelation. Of great voice, verse 1. Salvation and glory and honour and power unto the Lord our God, for true and righteous are his judgments. This is an effective king. He's judged the great whore which corrupt the earth with her fornication, hath avenged the blood of his servants at her hand. And they said, Alleluia. Her smoke rose up for ever and ever. And the 24 elders and the 4 living ones fell down and worshipped God that sat on the throne. There he is, the king, saying, Amen, Alleluia. Praise our God, all ye his servants, and ye that fear him, small and great. And here comes this sound. The great multitude, the voice of many waters, for the Lord God, the end of verse 6, omnipotent reigneth. And that king has a bride. And that bride is us. Let us be glad and rejoice, give honour to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come. His wife hath made herself ready. And to us it was granted that we should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of saints. And he saith unto me, Right, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And here we have this final vision of the King. Verse 11, heaven opened, a white horse, the one that sat upon him, faithful and true, judging and making war. His eyes as a flame of fire. On his head were many crowns, and he had a name written. And out of his mouth, verse 15, goes a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. He treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. There is the effective king. There is the king that we can put our confidence on. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And that, young people, brothers and sisters, that is the ultimate definition of the biblical version of what a king should be.